Hi there and welcome to today's Tech Talk webinar. I'm Douglas Clark, Global Director of Public Relations at eMarketer. Thanks for being with us today on Brand Live, especially as we cope with the coronavirus pandemic and the new normal. I am working from New Jersey and I'm joined by Neustar's John Marson. He's the Senior Principal Solutions Engineer, and Allison Deist, Head of Product Marketing and Customer Analytics. The topic today is CPG marketers, 3 steps to reveal your customer's purchase path. Today, John and Allison will be sharing practical tips to better understand your customer's journey at a one-on-one level and ways to get past common barriers faced by CPG marketers. Now, if your colleagues still want to join us, they can do so. You can use the link. If you want to share the link that you used to register with them, they can still sign up. And before we hear from our presenters today, please keep in mind you don't need to take notes. You're going to receive a link to view the slides and a full recording of today's presentation after it's over. And we want everybody to participate. You can use the window on the lower right-hand side of your screen to submit questions. You can send them in at any time. We'll try to respond to as many as we can a little bit later during the Q&A portion. So John is joining us from Austin, Texas. Allison is in Chicago. It's all yours, guys. Allison?
So before we begin, we'd like for you to take a quick poll. We really just want to understand where you sit in your MTA journey. You can find the poll by scrolling to the bottom of the screen. We want to know, has your team considered implementing multi-touch attribution? We're going to share these results later on in the presentation. So thank you in advance for participating. We really just can't wait to see those results. So to start, consumers today expect experiences like Amazon and Netflix. And this is not just from those tech companies, but really from all the brands that they do business with. Modern consumers have high expectations around proactive service, personalized interactions, and connected experiences across different channels. This goes well beyond the basic expectations of the past. Those were much more focused on quality service at a fair price. But today, marketers really have to have many more opportunities to engage with the consumer along their path to purchase. And in addition, 76% of consumers now report that it's easier than ever to take their business elsewhere. They're literally switching from brand to brand in order to find those personalized experiences that match those expectations. This is even more true in current times where inventory and selection may be really limited, particularly in some key categories. So brand loyalty may really be a thing of the past, but how do you hang on to those consumers once you do in fact reach them? So as competition have made it really easy for consumers to switch between those brands when they're not happy with their experiences. Shoppers today have access to a wide array of choices and channels to acquire the products that they need, particularly with the advent and the uptick in e-commerce. So what does this mean for consumer packaged goods and their brands? For years, we've been really focused on customizing and adapting our messages and experiences to the consumers and to interacting with our consumers in different ways. So now it's more imperative than ever to really understand which of those experiences inspire the consumer to make a purchase and aid in really growing your brand. In fact, multi-touch attribution, or as everyone likes to call it, MTA, can help build your brand. But how does it do that? MTA tells us which personalized experiences matter to the consumer and really drive impact for the business. In addition, many consumer packaged goods companies are being told, and marketers are being told to do MTA, and we want to do it, but how do you start, or which partners do you select? Is MTA even possible for CPGs since there's historically been so many gaps in the data ecosystem? And this slide just gives us a quick view on that sort of customers or the consumer's path to purchase. And much like each of us individually, consumers are exposed to many different messages in the course of our daily lives. When you wake up, you might grab your phone and check the news, or you see an ad for a new shampoo, which you might consider buying. And then later, you're searching for hair products or a new hairstyle, and you find a search ad for that same shampoo. And then you see that same shampoo on an ad while you're watching your favorite show that evening. And so finally, you decide to make a purchase. That journey is a concerted effort by advertisers to reach the right consumer at the right time and ultimately influence their purchase. Brands obviously want to understand which of those efforts had the greatest impact. Was it the display ad, the search ad, the TV ad? How do we optimize those efforts in the future to influence shoppers effectively? MTA helps us identify which brand interactions most inspire consumers to make a purchase. What we wanted to talk about, in particular on this slide, is just the typical changes or challenges that many brands face when it comes to MTA, particularly as it relates to the CPG categories. So what we want to start with is the idea that, analytical models may not capture all the channels and touch points where a consumer might engage with your brand. So this obviously includes walled gardens across both mobile and desktop devices. If you think about mobile and desktop in particular, consumers today may use one email address to log in and view their favorite news outlets. Maybe they're using another email address to log into their social media channels. And they switch between their laptop and their mobile devices, depending on if they're on the go, if they're at home. We have several folks in our team who've talked about how they have, upwards of 60 different email addresses that they use. And so it's really difficult to connect the shopper and the consumer across all of those different identifiers. In addition, we have limited access to granular data from Facebook, Pinterest, Google, Amazon, Snapchat. And so it makes it really difficult to get that complete picture of the impact associated with your marketing efforts and take informed action about where to invest in the future. Being able to connect online exposures to offline purchasing is critical when evaluating different MTA providers, particularly for CPG brands where a lot of our sales still take place in brick and mortar stores. So you really need a partner that can connect disparate data sets and leverage a customer identity graph that links to the household or individual level for more accuracy and actionability. External factors such as the weather, seasonality, competition, gas prices, these all have an effect on brand performance as well. And they're not featured in or captured in the model, then you're going to have a lot of unexplained results or potentially biased results. And finally, you need a model that's going to help us to integrate effectively into our current business processes and our analytical tools so that we can take, a single answer back to the business and enable effective data-driven decision making. So, these are all those challenges that we find within CPG. And so, that's why we wanted to ask the question around your individual experiences to sort of relate that back to some of the challenges that we've found. So, Doug, if you said we may have a little bit more responses now, would you mind sharing those with us?
Sure, of course. Just to recap, we asked, has your team considered implementing multi-touch attribution? Just over 70% said we've considered it, but have not yet initiated anything. 16% said we're currently deploying multi-touch attribution. Nearly 10% said we're currently initiating the process. And about 3% said we are reevaluating our current multi-touch attribution and may start over. Nobody said we're in the process of implementing our first multi-touch attribution project. So what do you think of those results? Anything surprising there?
Wow, 70%. That's high. I mean, that's great to hear that so many folks on the phone are really considering. And I think, these are those barriers or the things that most of our clients and the folks that we talk to that they find as inhibitors to trying to start that journey. And so we wanted to talk today a little bit about how do we tackle some of these challenges, particularly as it relates to, the things that we just put forward. So hopefully we'll give you a little bit of reassurance. So first, we wanted to talk about, being able to measure at a user level. So to combat some of these challenges, you really need to start with an identity resolution solution that enables our ability to connect the dots between online ad exposures and offline purchasing. Only then can you really understand what's working and what's not working for the brand. And, another key challenge that we hear of a lot is the ability to see the whole picture. So eMarketer in particular estimates that 68% of all digital ad spend flows to the top three platforms, Google, Facebook, and Amazon. This is why they're called the walled gardens, and this is why they matter. These are often blind spots for marketers. And so the challenges with cookie or pixel-based tracking, incomplete tracking via clicks, and increased focus on privacy really makes these platforms difficult to measure. So only, Neustar, because of our capabilities and our identity assets, only Neustar can really break down those walls and provide insight into performance across the entire consumer journey, all while protecting consumer privacy. In addition, CPG brands in particular have a need to access conversion data to really understand what choices consumers make when arriving at the store. So by working with a data agnostic provider, you can leverage whichever third-party sales data source you want to use, such as Datalogix, Numerator, Nielsen, IRI. And so these are all things that we want to talk a little bit more in depth about. And so with that, let's go to John, who can just talk a little bit more in detail around how we at Neustar tackle those challenges.
Excellent. So thank you, Allison. The next few slides, we'll just talk a little bit more in depth on how we go about measuring the impact of media on consumers in the context of CPG. First thing that we like to think about, or is a topic that needs to be addressed. So Allison mentioned that the data that we get for sales comes from various partners. And so when we think about MTA, we think of it in the context of measuring at the census level, all of my advertising, driving all the consumers that I might possibly address in a market. But because this data that we work with in CPG comes from panels, we need to think a little bit differently about how and what we're measuring. So we first start with building an analytical data set that comprises a combination of consumers or shoppers who were both exposed to media as well as not, and think about the complexities of doing that given that there are multiple channels a typical marketer is using. We also need to see, from a purchase perspective, consumers who both purchase the product as well as those that don't, or maybe those that also purchased in category but not necessarily your brand. So these are all things that we consider when assembling an analytical data set to do some measurement on. When we have that data set built, we need to then do our analytics and deal with another issue that comes up, right? Because we're working with a panel for that outcome data, we don't necessarily have a panel that's immediately representative of all of the consumers that we are addressing in a given market. This is an example of some of the skew or bias that we see in panels across various dimensions. On the left, I've got some examples of urbanicity. If we take, for example, maybe other panel number 2, so the black bar, we see that the rural dwellers maybe over-index in that panel, whereas that same panel in city dwellers under-indexes. Or for another example, over on the right, household income, again, we see differences in the panels and how they represent the various income brackets. So we leverage this data that we have to help us, I think of it as de-skew the data. Let's remove the bias from the data sets that we're using so that when we are doing analytics on it, we get a much fairer, accurate, better representation of the performance of our marketing. So we bring it all together with the following approach here. At the top here, we've got some math that represents the high level, the model that we use. It brings together 3 key concepts represented by these colored boxes. I actually like to start with the group on the right there. Those are the addressable media touches, right? So think of your display impressions, search clicks, email opens, paid social interactions. Really, for us, that's table stakes. We should, of course, have all of that data in our model. What we think makes for a more accurate, a more compelling approach is to include these 2 other concepts represented by the blue box and the green box. So in the blue box is consumer propensity, whether or not a given consumer is likely to interact or use products from a particular brand. In CPG, we want to look for signal like, is that consumer purchasing in that category? Are they purchasing your particular brand? Or are they not making any purchases at all in that brand or product category? And so that's data that, again, can come to us from those panels that we talked about earlier. The goal here is, in plain English, right, is to treat each consumer as if they're an individual. They all potentially respond differently to our marketing. If we just think of them as all responding the same, we'll not really be accurately measuring the effects of our media. And then in the middle, in the green box, we're bringing in various market level factors. While the goal of MTA is typically to get deep, granular insight into our addressable media channels, we can't ignore all of the market level factors that also impact consumers. So certainly things like traditional media, as well as all the non-marketing drivers that impact consumers. So we think of, in general, things like weather, economy, seasonality, competition, but also certainly in CPG, we need to think about things like price, promotion, distribution, discounting, et cetera. These are all factors that impact consumers, though the data itself may not be available at an individual level like we can get with both propensity scoring and the addressable media touches themselves. So when we bring this all together, at high level it results in something like we see in the next screen here. So this is a nice example of a few sequences that some consumers were exposed to. Let's focus on the first sequence and the third sequence. So if I look at the propensity scores, I see there's 60% for that first consumer, they're 11%, or it is 11% for that third consumer. 60%, maybe that indicates that this is someone who not only is buying in the category, but also your specific brand. 11%, again, maybe buying in the category, but not necessarily your brand. When I look at the next column of numbers, the offline media non-marketing driver scores, I see for today they're relatively the same. So this is accounting for all of the factors, distribution, price, economic factors, as well as any traditional media that the brand may have in play. And then I have 3 marketing touches. The math that was on the previous screen is used to give credit to these touches in a data-driven fashion. Here I've got simple explanation, just 3 touches. The reality is there could be between 1 and n touches. It's really more a factor of how far back in time we're looking. So when I add up the credits, I get 28% for that first conversion and 81% for that third one. High level conclusion from this, marketing played a much bigger role in driving that third sale versus that first one. And maybe some decision making that I could make from this. If I look in particular at the display advertising touch. Now, it's not just a display ad, right? It's part of a particular site, campaign, placement, creative. But for today, we've simplified it. But I see it gets very little credit in that first sequence and significantly more in that third sequence. And so to the extent that these individuals are actually part of consumer segments that I'm marketing to, and I have a lot of control over that these days, I'd probably shift my spend on that display advertising from consumers in that first segment to that third one because it's much more effective there. So wrapping up, a couple things. So first of all, obviously, we need to get access to the data. And as Allison said earlier, right, that data is available both through walled garden partnerships, the various providers of the sales data. Next, we need to look for a partner that has a sound modeling methodology, one that really accounts for all of the factors that impact consumers so that we can really get a fair and accurate accounting of the marketing itself. And then finally, right, we're not implementing MTA just for the sake of implementing MTA. We really want to use it to make better decisions about what's working well, what's not working well, so we can ultimately do a more effective job at our marketing. And with that, if there are any questions, I'll pass it back to Doug and we'll take some questions.
Okay, terrific. Well, John and Allison, thanks so much. Great presentation, great information for our audience. And speaking of our audience, they did send in a few questions for us. And by the way, if you have a question, it's not too late to send it in. We'll start with this one from George from New York. He's asking, this question will go to Allison. If we were to get started on multi-touch attribution tomorrow, what would be a good first step?
That's a great question. So, we typically start every engagement with a full review of the marketing plan, just so that we can understand, how much of your spend is happening within, particular digital platforms, digital social, search, etc. And that way we can just really understand which of the channels and tactics that are being used today to formulate those priorities around, what we measure and what we start with. So those are really the first steps, is just to understand that marketing plan.
Makes sense. Perfect. Okay. The next question will be for John. It comes from Justine from LA. She's asking, how long does it typically take to set up multi-touch attribution?
That's a great question. So a typical implementation takes, perhaps 4 to 5 months. We kick off the process with a kind of a comprehensive or an in-depth planning exercise. We really want to understand, as Allison mentioned earlier, what does your marketing plan really look like? We start the data collection process. Some of the data is collected with pixels, others via log files or direct integrations with partners. And then finally, once we've got data flowing in, we can start the modeling process and delivering insights. So typical implementation time around 4 to 5 months.
Perfect. And the next question will go back to Allison. It comes from Mike from New York. What are some of the best practices when setting up multi-touch attribution?
So we recommend that we start any engagement by just really gathering all those inputs. So, we talked a little bit about the marketing plan. John mentioned starting to set up the data collection process. But I think it really helps to start by identifying those key stakeholders and getting them involved early on in the process. So that typically involves folks like your media planning agency, the internal media teams if you have one, your marketing organization, and the analytics organization if you happen to have that within your team as well. So really just getting those key stakeholders around a table to start discussing about what are the key elements that we want to include, as well as how do we want to start this process, what is that process going to look like for our organization.
Okay, perfect. The next question will be for John. It comes from Amanda from Denver. What is required from us when we partner with an external multi-touch attribution provider? Anything for clients to keep in mind?
So there's two things that come to mind immediately when I think of this topic. The first is within your organization, where does the data actually reside? And so, things like both the platforms or systems that the data might reside in, as well as who owns it. And then and the reason why I say that is if I take a channel like display, the cost and context data may reside in the ad server, but it's highly likely that that's not really the source of truth for your data, and the source of truth may come after some massaging that data for either by internal or agency partners. So again, we want to figure out where's the data, who owns it, where's the right data come from, and then the second thing is understanding for the various stakeholders in a project like this, right? It has the possibility of impacting really everyone in your digital advertising or addressable media advertising ecosystem. And so what are their individual needs? A simple example is if I'm talking to someone who's the paid search manager versus the director of digital. They're going to have different requirements, and having an understanding within your organization of what those requirements really will be, I think is the second important step.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. The next question comes from Nate from Florida. We'll throw it out to both you guys. If one or both want to weigh in, that's great. What is the average ROS you see from online advertising?
So I can jump in on that. It's an interesting question. So when we look at kind of across a wide range of clients, and I'm giving sort of a very high level summary, it's probably ranges from maybe 10% to 30%. It depends somewhat on both brand recognition, whether you are a newer entrant into the market versus a longtime player. But we see again across all of our clients, when we take a holistic approach to evaluating the impact of media along with all of the other factors that impact a consumer, it ranges between maybe 10 and 30%.
Okay, perfect. Next question is for Allison. It comes from Laura from New York City. What are some of the pitfalls or watchouts when implementing multi-touch attribution?
So I think, when we begin an MTA, oftentimes we see clients are just really excited and they just want to get started and they want to measure everything right away. But we just know from experience that there's a fair amount of change management associated with implementing any new analytics program. So we just suggest that we start by, biting off small pieces and getting our heads wrapped around what that process looks like for any organization, and then scale up from there. So we focus on those top priorities by add in those additional publishers or platforms once we get the process right for the organization.
Okay, great. We have another question here. Jessica from New York City is asking, is this typically implemented on a campaign by campaign basis, or is it possible to measure multiple channels for one publisher?
I can take that. So we typically are measuring a brand and all of the campaigns associated with that brand over some period of time. Partly because for a given campaign, we typically think it has a goal, to drive sales of X product for, a particular scenario. And the reality is, your marketing campaigns can have halo effects. So one campaign may cross over and affect others. And so we want to account for that. We really want to get a kind of a more kind of holistic or comprehensive accounting of all of the things that are potentially impacting consumers, and that can include multiple campaigns that you may be running. And I think, Doug, there's a second part to that question. I'm drawing a blank on it. Maybe remind me.
Just asking, is it possible to measure multiple channels for one publisher?
Got it. Yes. And so the other thing that we're incorporating in these engagements are really want to get all of the various marketing channels that you're using. So, paid social, there's probably more than just Facebook you may be using. From a traditional display advertising, we want to incorporate that. If you're doing some search, it tends to be, a smaller role in CPG marketing, but we want to include channels like search. If you're doing other, kind of newer innovative things, video, audio, et cetera. I kind of think of it as, let's start with understanding what your marketing plan strategy is, and certainly look 80-20 rule, where's the vast majority of the investment going? And we want to focus on that, but we can really incorporate anything and everything that you're doing from a marketing perspective.
Okay, terrific. We have time for just one more question. We'll send it over to John again. It comes from Manny from San Francisco. He's asking, what should we expect in terms of measurement reporting? What format and how often?
That's a good question. So there are kind of broadly two types of, if you will, things that we deliver to our clients. So one is a web-based UI. It's available 7x24 to you and your agency partners. And it provides aggregated reporting across all of the typical dimensions that you might think of when measuring advertising. And then the other thing that we do for some clients as well, those that have investment in data warehouse, BI tools, et cetera, is we may also provide them a data feed. So allow them to incorporate some of this data into their own tools and reporting that works well for clients that have an investment in with their own analytics team in-house tools.
Okay, terrific. Well, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. John and Allison from Neustar, thanks so much for being with us. Thanks for the great information from the presentation, and thanks for answering those questions from the audience. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Before we wrap up, let me just take a moment to let you know what's coming up across eMarketer's media channels. You can check out and register for live analyst and Tech Talk webinars. Just go to our website, eMarketer.com/webinars. On the audio side, you can tune into Behind the Numbers. It's our daily podcast. And you can also sign up for the eMarketer daily and retail newsletters. They'll be sent right to your inbox, covering everything from digital marketing, media, and e-commerce trends, and of course, the latest updates on how the pandemic is affecting our industry. So again, keep in mind, you're going to receive a link to view the slides and a full recording of today's presentation in your email. Feel free to share it with your colleagues. We hope you got something out of it. We really appreciate you joining us. We'll see you back here next time on another Tech Talk.